And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are across the globe joining us today. My name is Lisa. I work here at Acquia, and we're thrilled to kick off today's webinar. Today's webinar is about Drupal development, best practices to accelerating your projects. Today we have Acquia's Senior Product Marketing Manager, Maggie Schroeder, and the CTO of the Drupal Association, Tim Lennon. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please do send them in the Q&A tab, and I will assist you personally. If you have any questions for the presenters, please make sure to submit them in the Q&A tab as well. And they're happy to answer any questions towards the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. Slides and the recording of this webinar will also be posted to acquia.com and sent to you via email within the next few days. So without further ado, I will pass it over to our first speaker, Maggie Schroeder. Maggie, kick it off.
Awesome. Hi, everyone, and thanks for hopping on this afternoon, maybe this morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Super excited to be here today talking about some Drupal development best practices. And I wanted to kick things off today by starting the conversation with, setting up the right environment and preparing for your ultimately what will be your DevOps workflow. And so really the first part of this, right, and I already referenced to it, and if Tim, you'll actually switch to the next slide, it's all about supporting your DevOps workflow with the right infrastructure and making sure that you're architecting that infrastructure, not just generally, but specifically for Drupal applications. And so right off the bat here, right, you need to think about building the right hosting infrastructure. And that means a couple things, right? So first and foremost, you need to choose. You have a couple choices. You can build on-prem, or you can also build in the cloud, which is becoming super popular today. And then, from here, it's not just, selecting the right hosting provider or, selecting to do this on premises. It's also, configuring everything from your storage to your databases, to your file systems, and setting up your web servers and ultimately caching and maybe even some load balancers, and at the end of the day, optimizing that by adding on a CDN, right? So there's a lot of different facets that go into creating the right hosting infrastructure for your Drupal application. And we also need to keep in mind, during this process, right, that it's important to choose the right infrastructure for, and I've referenced this before, a Drupal application, which is going to behave differently from some of your other enterprise applications, right? And a great example of this, we see all the time is that, maybe for your Drupal application, you're going to end up running a ton of cron jobs. So one of the considerations for that is that, you're going to want to make sure that you're selecting compute optimized servers, right, to support that kind of load at the end of the day, because you don't want any disruption, to your end users because of these cron jobs that you might be running on your application. And of course, there are tons of other considerations to take, and I won't dive into those here today, but just to give you, again, that high level, right, there are a ton of things to consider while building out your infrastructure. And then moving on beyond, right, just, building that hosting infrastructure, there's also some tools that you'll need to consider on top of that. And some of those include, right, platform monitoring or even application monitoring. We want to make sure that we have all the tools we need to dive into, in case there is an issue that you run into. You want to know, is it the code? Is it the node? It's like one of my favorite IT phrases. I feel like I overuse it, but here makes a ton of sense, right? So right, we want to make sure that we're monitoring not just at the platform level, but also at the application level. So if we do run into any of those errors, we can deep dive, troubleshoot, and identify exactly where that error is occurring. And also, of course, on top of this, right, it's not just about monitoring, it's about being a little bit proactive to that. So we talked a little bit about the hosting infrastructure before, but it's all about building in, high availability, and ultimately, in case of a crazy disaster, which, fingers crossed, we always hope that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does, you have a plan. And one of the things that I always like to point to, and it was actually I just entered tech, and it was, I think 2017, AWS had a huge S3 outage. And we just saw how organizations scramble. And I know that there have been a ton since then, but that was one, I actually wrote one of my first tech blogs about that outage, and, making sure that you had the right disaster recovery plans in place to manage that, right? At that time, I think a lot of people were still very new to the cloud, and even today we're still, best practices are still evolving. And even on premises, right, it's important to have those plans. So again, when it comes to that hosting infrastructure, platform monitoring, super important, application monitoring, and also ensuring that you're building in best practices for DR and HA as well. And so at this point, though, you're still not finished. I referenced that 2017 S3 outage. We've also seen how security and maybe the lack thereof can impact organizations and ultimately, a brand. And so it's important to consider different features that you'll want to build into your platform in order to enhance the security, both of your hosting platform at the end of the day, but also your application. And then beyond just, building in these different features, you'll also want to consider, does your organization require different compliance standards, and what extra, additional work is needed to meet those compliance requirements, again, that your organization might need. So, a lot of different things to consider when setting up your infrastructure. But now, of course, on to the fun part, right? And that's setting up your development environments. And, maybe setting them up isn't the fun part, the development is. But so when it comes to setting up, your development environments, you're going to want to, of course, do your research, download, install, but really getting down into the nitty gritty, it's about, setting up your local LAMP stack, setting up tools like Composer and Drush, maybe even Xdebug. Considering, your operating system and what software versions you're running locally, but also your teammates, right? You might not all be leveraging the same kind of systems, right? And then also making sure that, is your development environment that you're creating compatible with your machine and your team's machines? And then beyond that, right, keeping all of this secure. So security doesn't just stop at the infrastructure. It doesn't just stop there. It also means, making sure that these development environments that you and your team are going to be working in are secure, making sure that you have the right access and privileges given to the different developers on your team to make sure, again, that they have the right level of access to these environments. And so, again, that's really just a very short explanation of setting up infrastructure and then preparing and ultimately creating your development environments. And I mentioned that the fun part, isn't really setting it up, it's actually getting to the development. And so with that, I'll actually pass it over to Tim, who will walk you through the fun part of all of this. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much, Maggie. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's great for me to be here as a guest speaker from the Drupal Association. I love to talk about this stuff. So what I'd like to talk about when it comes to accelerating your Drupal development is about how you leverage the ecosystem itself, the open source project, the community-driven project that is Drupal, and all of the different tools that you can use to do that. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. And I'd love to go into any of these topics in more detail if you do have questions. So again, feel free to fill out that Q&A as we go, and we'll get back around to those. So one of the biggest advantages of leveraging a major open source project like Drupal is how large this ecosystem is. There are more than 40,000 individual projects hosted on Drupal.org. So those are the plugins, the extensions, the modules as we call them, the themes, the distributions of Drupal that you have to choose from. But of course, that's also a hugely overwhelming number. 40,000 projects is a lot of wheat to separate from the chaff. So how do you go through evaluating what components of what's available for Drupal you actually need to use for your use case in your project? So the simplest explanation is stand on the shoulders of giants. Look for examples that already exist in the ecosystem of very similar projects to your use case, or at least things that have an overlapping component to what you're doing. So there are a lot of case studies on Drupal.org that were submitted exactly for this purpose that show people in a variety of industries, in healthcare, in government, in libraries, in higher ed, in commerce that have these sort of overlapping use cases that you can look at and say, well, I'm not doing exactly what they're doing, but this component of what they're doing, the way they've set up these remixable views of their library content or whatever, that's applicable to my project. So how did they do that? So just to give you the basic overview, on Drupal.org, the case study section of the site has filters where you can filter by version and industry and kind of scroll through the variety of case studies that are available. It's a great way to get an initial orientation. But then more specifically, when you're looking at case studies, as you scroll through, for example, this e-commerce platform site, you want to know the specific technical solutions they used, right? So most of these case studies are going to have this technical specification section that talk about the key modules used by the site. And that's a really good jumping off point for your own internal evaluation of which community contributed tools you can use to jumpstart your Drupal project. So of course, maybe you do that, you look through a number of case studies or you do independent research and you've got a list of, modules or themes that you're evaluating, but how do you, what do you do from there? How do you go further with that evaluation? Or if you haven't been able to find what you need. Let's talk about modules first. If you're coming from another ecosystem, again, these are what you might know as plugins or extensions. These are just the additional sort of functionality available to Drupal. Again, you can filter by which version of Drupal it works for, whether it's a currently maintained module, the kind of security coverage it has, and you can see all of these modules sort of sorted by how much they're used out in the ecosystem, how commonly they're installed across Drupal, which is a nice indicator that you might want to take a look at it as well. When you're on a specific module page, you're going to see some indicators that, again, are helpful for evaluating whether you should consider it for a production-ready project. So if we look here at Drupal Commerce, we see a variety of signals, including which versions are currently supported and that it's compatible with, as well as you see these little shield icons next to the download as it scrolls down here, that indicate that this receives coverage from the Drupal volunteer security team. So you have the advantage of the community's security resources to help you out. Similarly, you can look at distributions as a way to kind of kickstart the project that you're doing. So distributions are essentially install profiles of Drupal that put together a couple of partly pre-configured sets of modules and maybe a theme to go with them that are oriented around a specific purpose. So again, you can filter them and search by version compatibility and see kind of the most commonly used distributions. And you'll see as you go through that there's a few different kinds of distributions out there. There's ones around learning management systems, ones around running sort of social media experiences, ones around publishing and things like that. So again, you can go through and look at these. One of the distributions that Acquia maintains, for example, is the Lightning distribution, which is focused on the editorial experience and authoring experience. So it's a really great starting point if you need that robust permission and role system for whatever project you're working on. And there are others as well. We saw the Thunder CMS back there, which is a similar sort of editorially based distribution, but specifically for the publishing and media world. Themes as well are going to be a starting point that you'll want. In most cases, for the kind of ambitious projects that are done with Drupal, you're not just going to use a theme completely off the shelf, sort of set and forget it, but rather you're going to use the theme as a starting point for maybe your front-end team members to brand and build out your experience. So as you'll see, when you go through the same filtering process of themes, many of the top used themes in Drupal, compatible with different versions, are actually sort of frameworks for styling your site. So it's maybe gets you set up with the Bootstrap framework or with sort of adaptive Flexbox-based frameworks. So they give you all the tools to remix and display all of your content coming out of Drupal in various ways, but let you kind of finish it off with the specific visual design and brand that the front-end parts of your team might need to make. So, that gets you through sort of using all of the individual components that are contributed by the community to kind of give you a head start. And between all of these different things, you can probably get a pretty solid prototype of almost any experience together in the course of about an afternoon. But you're almost always going to have a custom use case. You're almost always going to have some unique value proposition that might need some custom code on your end. So there are some best practices for how we recommend that you handle your custom code, and some do's and do nots as it comes to putting this together. So to go into those kind of briefly, best practices, we want to manage your custom code in one or more custom modules. So written the same way that one of the community contributed modules is. That keeps your code self-contained, that keeps it easy to upgrade the rest of your software stack with any updates that you need without causing disruptions. And ideally, you want to group those by the areas of functionality. This should be easy to do. You should be able to extend the functionality of any part of Drupal in a sort of standard way, because Drupal's an API first platform, right? It's built with APIs that let you extend pretty much every component of the underlying CMS. You don't want to hack core or hack contrib. This is something you've probably heard if you've been near the Drupal sphere before, but if it's your first time, what we mean is don't go into Drupal itself and just start overwriting the code with small changes that you might need for your specific use case. It might feel at first that like scaffolding out a custom module for what feels like a small change to maybe, I don't know, time zone handling or something seems like a lot of effort, but the advantage of actually doing that instead of hacking core is you don't block your security updates. You don't block the ability to update the software. You make it much, much easier to keep your site well maintained and efficiently maintained. So just avoid the temptation to do that as a quick and dirty fix. We also strongly recommend that you follow semantic versioning best practices. So Drupal as a project has moved into Semver as a standard, and we recommend it for anybody using it for client work or internal projects as well. So in case you're not familiar, the idea behind Semver is that for most people, developers or not, version numbers have just been, well, make the number go up if something changes, and if it's a big change, increment the number in front of the period, and that's not really very useful in the long term. So Semver gives us a standard that's meaningful. So your 3 digits are your major version, your minor version, and your patch version. The major version changes only when you have a backwards compatibility breaking change. So you're changing a fundamental API, you're deprecating something. A minor version increment would be whenever you're adding new features, but you've retained all of your existing functionality. And then your patch incrementation is for bug fixes and minor improvements that you might be making. So we strongly recommend that. And using Semver for your custom code development process actually goes hand in hand with these other best practices. So we recommend that you're writing those custom integrations for a generic use case. You want to be able to extend them further in the future. 2 years from now, your future self will thank your past self for creating a generic API for, inserting a new date format instead of hard coding a specific one, right? Those things are just always going to save you technical debt in the future. Similarly, though, building in that way is building as if you were going to contribute. So we say in the Drupal community that you always want to build as if you're going to contribute that code. So code written with contribution in mind is inevitably higher quality, and there's a few reasons for that. One, if you're intending to contribute something, then that means you're following coding standards. You're documenting it well. And you're documenting it not just for yourself or an internal team, you're documenting it in the way that says an external party could read this and understand where we're going. It means you're following best practices like not hacking core and all these other elements. So we really encourage you to focus on a contribution mindset when writing the custom code that you need, even if you can't ultimately share it on Drupal.org, although I encourage you to do so if you can, and we can talk about that a bit more. So again, why do we say that we do this? Because code written for contribution has better readability, better conformance to standards. And if you do, in fact, contribute it, you'll get the advantage of peer review from the community, or maybe even free contributions from people as in the open source Drupal community who find it useful as well. You may find that you've saved a lot of resources because someone else is willing to build out that version 2 of the module you've contributed back. So there's always value in thinking of things in that way. So if you go down that road and you've built some custom code for your Drupal site, there's something, maybe it integrates with a service that you operate, maybe it's just some interesting variation on the way the views module works or something like that. you'll want to give that back if you can. And contribution can feel intimidating in any open source community, but it's really not as hard as you think. So Drupal.org has switched as of a couple of years ago to using GitLab on the back end. So if you're familiar with GitHub or GitLab, the repository management process and code commenting and review process is all very familiar. You can now use merge requests on Drupal.org. So the actual contribution process is much simpler than you may think. When you're doing that, if you need to, you can of course set up multiple remotes. So if you have a private branch for internal work, you can maintain that, but push separately to a branch that you might sync with Drupal.org for your contributions. And anyone is capable of submitting a project. So you just have to sign up for an account and agree to the Git terms of service, and you can do that. And you know, by working in that way and coming together, we can keep advancing Drupal to what it is today. It's so many other people, thousands, even tens of thousands of other developers who've chosen to do that in the past, that has resulted in Drupal being the tool of this quality that it is right now. So I could go on for a very long time talking about contribution and Drupal development itself. And again, I'd love to answer some more of those questions. I do see some coming in that we can talk about at the end here. But I'd like to throw it back to Maggie to talk about how we take that code that we've written on our DevOps environment and turn it into a build, test, launch workflow. So handing it to you, Maggie.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think it's awesome. There's so many awesome best practices that, you know, Tim just walked through that I think are applicable also, you know, as you start looking at your own internal development process, right? And Tim really hinted at it too. You know, it all starts with a really awesome development environment, and that's just a great idea. But then, of course, you need to get into this flow, right? It's not just about the development, but it's also about, you know, iteration. And also, unfortunately, you know, I don't know why I get to talk about the not fun parts, but maintenance and debugging as well. But, you know, you're going to have a lot of different places where you're going to have to end up implementing changes to your code. And again, I mentioned a couple of these, right? It could be security updates. It could be, you know, general maintenance. It could be bug fixes. And then we always hope it's something new, awesome, innovative, and something you're really excited about. But regardless of where this is coming from, and, you know, again, it's really about getting into a good flow. And Tim mentioned, right, again, going back to this, it starts with your development environment, but the next part is super important as well, which is the review. And why do we review? Well, to avoid, and I have this on the next slide, but we won't go there yet, but production phobia, right? It's fear of pushing something to production and then all of a sudden having to go back into maintenance mode. It's something we hear about. I actually had to like select from a bunch of different memes that I found about it. I don't know if I chose the most fun one, but I totally urge you to go out and just like Google like production fail or something like that meme. I had a lot of fun looking through them. But anyway, right? So review, super important, helps to eliminate that production phobia. And of course, after that phase, you're going to want to make sure that, of course, you know, continuous integration is run before and after merging. And the first part of that, right, is to run the continuous integration as part of your pull request and then as part of your integration build. So really the workflow ends up, you know, the best practice workflow, standard developer workflow really ends up looking like, you know, going from your development environment, submitting your pull request, and then your continuous integration build runs. You review that request, super important to for that review to happen. And then you either merge or, you know, sometimes it gets sent back to yourself if you're the developer, or, you know, someone on your team sends it back to the developer. It happens, but that's why we do that review. And then the continuous integration build runs. And finally, you either push to, you know, your hosting repository, you know, if you have one of those, or to, you know, ultimately your production site, right? So again, fairly simplified there, what I walked through, and this is from a super high level. And of course, it's going to, you know, vary to some degree within your organization. You know, you might have different reviewers, you might have a different review process. But again, this This kind of standardized process should be followed, again, to some degree for all of the code changes being made. So that includes maintenance and security updates. And while some steps, right, of course, like fixing bugs, might not be required for each code change, testing or review, etc. Code change, testing and review should always be done, right? You want to implement that testing, that review process to make sure, again, and if we go to the next slide, you'll see, not so much fun than me and my toes, but production phobia. We're avoiding that at the end of the day. The fear of screwing up your production database. It could be anything, but right. And I love like the little quote there. What do you mean I'm not logged into the test server right now? Like I'm in all the fun hashtags there. Hate my life. Yeah. So again, trying to avoid this at the end of the day. And just here, as a summary, right, of everything that I just went through, right, deploy development or staging environment, perform that QA, fix any bugs, right, schedule that production deployment, and then execute. And then, a couple other subsequent tests, right? But you can see final testing in there, right? Always testing, always reviewing, and just making sure that, again, you've got that standardized process internally so that you're covering all of your bases and we avoid that hate my life hashtag. So, and with that, I actually, this is one of the things that I think comes up, and see, I lied. I brought two memes into here, right? What do you mean my code doesn't always work, right? But when it does, it works on my machine, right? You always get that kind of like, oh, but it works on my machine. It doesn't work on yours. It works on mine. It's fine. And I actually think that this is a really, I think, pretty common occurrence, right? And I brought on a special guest today. So our special guest is Aurelian. He is a product manager here at Acquia, and he's going to walk you through cloud IDEs. And the reason I brought up that meme before is because cloud IDEs, amongst many other use cases, they really do address that problem of but it works on my machine. So with that, I'll pass it over to Aurelian to briefly introduce himself while I pull up the demo of cloud IDEs that he's recorded for us. So Aurelian, I'll pass it over to you for just to say a couple words if you'd like.
Thank you, Maggie. Hello, everybody. So yes, I'm Aurelian Navarre. I'm the product manager for Acquia Cloud IDE, and I'm really excited to be here with you today because we can show you how it's like to use a modern IDE in the cloud. And Maggie, you can play this video now. It's pretty exciting.
Hello, my name is Aurelian Navarre, and I'm the product manager for Acquia Cloud IDE. I'm really excited to give you a demo of how it works and the problems it solves. But first, let's talk about what Acquia Cloud IDE is. It is the only web-based source code editor and integrated development environment for Drupal. It allows you to write, run, and debug Drupal applications as a service. You don't need to set up your local machine. With only a web browser, you can have an IDE at your fingertips within minutes. With Acquia Cloud IDE, gone are the days of configuration hurdles and environment disparity. You have access to repeatable environments in the cloud that just work. There's no more corporate firewalls or networking issues in the way, so you can stay productive at all times. Acquia Cloud IDE is integrated with the cloud platform with lightning-fast synchronization from your cloud environments. It has built-in Git support, so you can make code changes and deploy seamlessly. It is optimized for Drupal development with access to pre-configured Composer, Composer 2, Drush, PHP Code Sniffer, etc. And you even have full support for running all Drupal tests. There's a built-in, shareable, real-time web view, so you can perform code changes and view results immediately. And you can even debug your application effortlessly with Xdebug pre-configured. Last but not least, Acquia Cloud IDE ships with Acquia CLI, which has everything you can expect from a command line interface. There's a full integration with the Cloud Platform API and its 200 plus endpoints, and multiple commands to help you stay productive at all times in IDEs, such as switching PHP versions or toggling Xdebug. Okay, let's jump right in. Here's Acquia Cloud IDE in action. The Get Started page conveniently gives me one-click access to configuring my IDE and synchronizing my application from the cloud platform to the IDE. Upon clicking the Copy from Acquia Cloud button, I immediately get access to a terminal window running a command that will allow me to refresh my code, database, and files from my preferred cloud environment. Not only this, it will also take care of installing Composer dependencies, clearing Drupal caches, and sanitizing the DB via Drush. Taking it from here, you will benefit from several out-of-the-box configuration settings to start developing Drupal right away. Think about automated database credentials, Drupal hash salt, or trusted host patterns, among other things. You can view your site in the browser or in the IDE and immediately start using the Drupal tooling available. Once you're happy with your changes, commit to Git and push to cloud. With Xdebug pre-configured out of the box in Cloud IDE, developers remain productive at all times. Acquia Cloud IDE is made by Drupalists for Drupalists, and it's just a start. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're super excited about Cloud IDE. I don't know if we have any Acquia customers, but just so everyone knows on this call, we did just add one Cloud IDE to all Acquia Cloud customer subscriptions. So if we do have any customers on the call, reach out to your account manager. They'll help you get set up. And of course, this is available and included for anyone who's interested in Cloud IDE. We'd be happy to link you with someone to talk to about Cloud IDE in more depth. But I think with that, Aurelian, do you have any last things that you want to add as well before we pass it back to Tim?
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. I really want to insist on this being a new paradigm. A decade ago, everybody was wondering why people wouldn't be moving their assets to the cloud. And now in 2020, it's like the same thing, but with your IDE. Everybody is wondering now why people are not moving their IDE to the cloud. And this is the problem that Cloud IDE solves. So again, if you have any questions, let's talk about them later. Let's answer your questions and make sure that you have every single questions answered at the end of this meeting, this webinar, obviously.
Awesome, thanks Aurelian. Lisa has been curating questions for us and getting things together. I think you've been seeing them come in the QA tab, and I feel like we had some as well before from social and other places. Do you want to kind of kick things off and run us through them?
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like a pretty chatty crowd, which is what we love, right? And so happy to start with the first question here. I think this is a good sort of high-level question for a lot of us on the call. What are some advantages that Drupal provides over other CMS projects? Why choose Drupal?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And it's a really big question because if you go back to the history of CMS projects, right, Drupal's about 20 years old. And if you go sort of early on, there was a lot of open source CMS projects in that same era. WordPress, Drupal, Typo3, Joomla, a lot of these different projects kind of emerged around the same time. But over the course of the intervening 20 years, they've specialized into different areas and started doing a number of different things. So what we'd like to say, and what Dries, the founder, has said about Drupal is that Drupal's the CMS for ambitious digital experiences. So what does he mean by that? What can we unpack from that statement? What that means is not necessarily, oh, Drupal's for enterprise use cases, although it includes those enterprise use cases. It means that Drupal is for any use case where you're just going beyond the basics of simple CMS management. You're not just making pages and blog posts, but you're starting to remix atomic components of content in a reusable way. You are starting to consider using the API first nature of the CMS to distribute to multiple channels, whether they're web channels like traditional web pages, mobile devices, or even more exotic things like subway signage and in-flight entertainment kind of use cases, right? So there's a lot of use cases that are supported by the modern versions of Drupal that take it sort of beyond what you traditionally think of as a CMS into this sort of digital experience platform. So I would say that's kind of the main reason to consider Drupal over other CMS use cases. Yeah.
Totally. And Tim, I'll actually just layer on there a little just to add. But also, if you look at, the pace of innovation over like even the past 5 years, right? And whenever I give this example, I'm not wearing it, but I have an Apple Watch. I just bought it like 3 or 4 months ago. But like 5 years ago, I don't think any of us would be wearing an Apple Watch. And of course, as technologies like the Apple Watch evolve, or Alexa or Google Home, I've got a Google Home too, right? It's really important to be able to deliver content across those new platforms that your customers are engaging with. And so I think one of the awesome benefits of Drupal is because of that amazing community that backs Drupal and those contributed modules. You're seeing modules come out that are compatible with the Alexa, compatible with a Google Home, even an Apple Watch, right? And they're coming about much faster than other CMS projects can also, create those, right? We're not seeing proprietary vendors coming out with those kind of integrations nearly as fast. So it really helps, you and your organization to stay ahead of the curve and adopt those platforms even faster. So yeah, just to layer on. So power of the community really at the end of the day is such a huge benefit here.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's see. So maybe this is best for Maggie. Do you use Acquia Dev Desktop for local development? Do all professional Drupal devs use ADD?
Yeah, Dev, I can take that. So I would say yes, you can still use Acquia Dev Desktop for local development. And so that's, of course, if you want to be making changes offline to your code. That being said, if you saw that really awesome demo that Aurelian gave, if you have the ability to be online, right, and develop in the cloud, then we would definitely say, use Cloud IDE. We think that the experience there is awesome. But yeah, Dev Desktop is still a great option for local development.
Awesome. And then a couple of questions around the IDE. Is there an Acquia Cloud platform free tier to try out the Cloud IDE?
So I think
Got it.
Maggie answered this one. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Aurelian.
So we just granted one free IDE for every single subscription on Acquia Cloud. So yes, there is, and you can try it out today.
Yeah, and I would say, so what does one Cloud IDE mean? That means one environment. And then is there a free place to try this? A Cloud IDE is not available for Acquia Cloud free today. So I would just say reach out to, I'm happy to reach out to you and provide some additional information about how we could get you access, to demo that out or ask any additional questions that you have around the IDE.
How is the IDE, sorry, I'm just rereading this question. How is the IDE for work with the ACSF right now? Does that make sense?
So Cloud IDE is fully compatible with Site Factory, if that's the question. The one difference between Acquia Cloud Enterprise or the Cloud Platform Enterprise and Site Factory is that you have, by design, a multi-site, and you can definitely select your DB and files from Site Factory as well. So that works. We've tested this, and we have customers actually running on Site Factory using Cloud IDE every day.
And Aurelian, we have a lot of questions coming in about the IDE product. So does the Cloud IDE work for projects that use both Composer and NPM?
Yes, by default, we tend to make sure that everything we do is supporting the vision for Drupal, which is now using Composer by default. So we have Composer and Composer 2 pre-configured in the IDE, and we also have support for NPM. If you have NPM needs, then yes, it's definitely supported within IDEs.
Is the IDE available outside of Acquia Cloud, like Dev Desktop?
No, it's not. It's fully integrated to the Cloud Platform workflows, so it's only available on Acquia Cloud.
Awesome, thank you. Great set of questions here. So next set here is, what is the difference between Acquia and Pantheon for hosting a Drupal site? My main concern is performance, although the cloud IDE is great.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, and that's from Christian. So thanks, Christian, for throwing that question in there. I'd say, for performance, again, Acquia is guaranteeing a 99.95% uptime SLA, right? So as far as performance and availability of your application goes, you're getting that guarantee. And additionally, I'll say as well, I've heard great things, especially recently, about our support team really being there, not just for, platform. I mentioned the 2 layers, right, of monitoring your application. It's all about making sure that the platform's performant as well as the application. And I think one of the key pieces of feedback I hear from our customers all the time is that, our team is not just there to help with the platform, but also provide application support as well. And it's because of our Drupal expertise that we're able to provide that. And of course, there's a ton of other nuances that I could go into, between the two. But I'd say just for today, if your main concern is performance, you're going to get performance from both hosting platforms. I would say it's also about, what other features are you looking for as well. Of course, we highlighted the Cloud IDE here today, but there are many other features that Acquia offers. And our goal really is to help customers get to the next level and implement different, facets to their Drupal applications. So take advantage of things like low-code site building if they're interested in that, and help them get to, the next level of personalization and expand and help you to really progress some of your marketing initiatives as well as IT initiatives. So again, tons of detail we could go into, and I'm happy to connect, again, Christian, offline if you have additional questions. So thanks for tossing that one in there.
Awesome, thanks, Maggie. Is Cloud IDE only limited to projects hosted on Acquia Cloud, or can developers use it for any project?
So that's a similar question to the previous one. Yes, it's only limited to the cloud platform, the Drupal cloud platform. So you cannot use Cloud IDE with a different platform. It's only on Acquia Cloud.
Awesome. Okay, great. And Tim, I actually pinged you a question I was unclear about. Maybe you can help me reword the question that I sent over to you, if you want to.
It looks like we had one of our anonymous attendees asks, what are best practices for unit testing, code sniffing, code linting, all of that for Drupal in general? It says for the Drupal project. And do you have any module suggestions? So it's a really good question. So I'll give 2 answers. I'll give the first kind of community contribution oriented answer, which is that if you're contributing to Drupal and if you're participating in, say, fixing a bug in Drupal core or working on an existing contributed module, there's a system on Drupal.org called Drupal CI that automatically runs code linting tests, code sniffing, will run any PHP unit tests that have been included in the code. So for all of that publicly hosted community-driven code, you can do things that way. For your own work, there are a variety of tools created by the community. There's the Coder module, which you can get on Drupal.org, and PHP Code Sniffer. And using those 2 things together are probably the best way to get started on your sort of code quality coverage. So I'll send you a link to a great article by a community member here in the Q&A section that you can read up more about that.
Awesome, thank you, Tim. Well, I'll keep plugging away here because we have some time and we have lots of good questions coming in from the audience. So let's see, question from Michael, is it possible to set up the IDE to work with Bitbucket repository?
Yes, absolutely. You can plug it in with any version control system you'd like. So it can be GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. It's really flexible. You can do whatever you'd like. You just have to create an SSH key, add it there, and you can pull and push code as usual. It's really flexible.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm seeing another question here that I might grab really quickly, Lisa. So Diren asks, Could Drupal be used in a use case like a hospital management system, using Drupal to build that up? And yes, that's absolutely possible. There are certainly organizations that already do this from around the world in a number of different places. So all of the sort of application requirements are certainly things that can be built with the flexibility that exists in Drupal. Of course, there's other considerations as well that you need to look into, regulatory considerations like HIPAA compliance and things like that. So it might be worth, again, looking at case studies from the healthcare industry or even consulting with other organizations that have specifically done healthcare-oriented implementations, just so that you're caught up with any of those gotchas. But yeah, absolutely possible, and something that's been done in the wild quite a bit as well.
Okay, so this is for anyone who wants to take this one. Acquia BLT is a great tool for development, but can be configured in Mac and Linux. Can we use BLT in Windows?
I think I'll take this one. BLT is just PHP. So if you can run PHP code on your laptop or workstation, then yes, you can run BLT on Windows. That's not a problem at all.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're getting down to the last few set of questions. Tim, or Maggie, or either of you really, there was a question, and I would definitely not.
Is this the one from David about?
I would butcher it, is what I was trying to say, about data migrations from one environment to another.
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I'm not sure if it's specific to the IDE environment. It might be, in which case I'll let Maggie sort of speak to that side. But the question is, how do we accomplish pushing from your development environment to staging or production environments? Like, what's the actual process of pushing it through that workflow, I think is sort of what the question is. And so typically this is part of the dev workflow pipeline that's built into a number of these tools. And I assume that's essentially the case with the Cloud IDE tools as well, but I'll let Maggie speak to that.
Yeah, and I'll actually pass that one over to Aurelian. I think that he has the expertise there. Aurelian, would you mind adding a little bit of color?
I'm reading this question a bit differently. I think it's more about potentially the workspaces module, like making sure that you have content in dev, for instance, and you can push it to stage for Q&A, etc. So I think this is not about Cloud IDE per se. It's more about how you can push changes to a different environment so you can have people review it and before you push to prod. And that can be solved directly within Drupal. You know? That's one of the great powers of Drupal. It's to allow you to have some previews before you push your code to a different environment. And the Workspaces initiative was all about that, making sure that we could make this a thing. So that's really much a focus that many Drupal developers have, and they want this feature to be available in Drupal. So this is why people started contributing. That's the power of open source as well. People started contributing to get this feature, you know, to help them on a day-to-day basis, because that's a very common requirement, obviously.
Thanks, Aurelian. From the chat, I think you're absolutely right. This was about content workflows rather than configuration. So yes, absolutely, the workflows module built into Drupal is the way to go.
Awesome, thank you. I like this question. I think it's gets us a little bit out of Cloud IDE for a second, but I think it's very relevant to everyone today. So, oops, pull it up again. What locations? Oh no, I lost the question that I was saying that I love the question. Hold on, where did it go? I'll find it later. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Lisa, while you're answering or while you're looking for that, I can actually answer one of the questions that's up in Q&A, which is, you know, do you have to run, do you have to use Acquia for Drupal, or can you host it on your own in AWS? And to that, I will say that, you know, the first part of this presentation was about, you know, making that choice yourself. You can totally run it natively on AWS. You can run it natively on Azure. You could run it on premises as well. It's all about, you know, what you're really looking to get at the end of the day. I would say hosting platforms like Acquia, like Pantheon, Platform SH at the end of the day. You know, all the above, we offer that additional, you know, that the infrastructure is already set up, so you don't have to worry about that. And so, you know, of course, again, it's all up to you. If you want to manage your own AWS infrastructure, great. If you want additional features that, somewhat a hosting platform, and, I'm from Acquia, so a little bit biased here, of course, but, if you want access to things like the Cloud IDE, if you want access to an expert support team for Drupal, if you want that application level support, and if you want a guaranteed 99.95% uptime SLA, and ultimately access to products for personalization down the road, or even low-code site building, right? I would say, look to a hosting provider. But if you're just looking for, a place to run Drupal, you've got boundless options.
Yeah, absolutely. And that relates, there's some other Drupal sort of specific questions here that I might jump into anyway. So one of the questions again from Diren is, if new PHP versions come out, can we continue to run our old Drupal site? So the answer is slightly complicated because it depends on the specific versions. But if you look on Drupal.org, you'll see what versions of PHP are supported across the different versions of Drupal. So depending on which version of Drupal you're talking about, there's a range of supported PHP versions. It's a pretty broad range, so you shouldn't have trouble in most cases. There are some hosting services that are a little behind the times, particularly in sort of the shared hosting world, that don't have the latest versions of PHP available. So you may need to look into that a little bit, but that's coming to a lot of other places as well. So again, it'll depend on your specific versions, but you can find it all documented on Drupal.org.
And to add to that, I would probably stress that what matters is that you're running on a supported PHP version, because it's not about always chasing the latest PHP version. PHP 8 is going to come out very soon, but it doesn't mean that PHP 7.4 is no longer a thing. It's just a matter of making sure that your site is secure and you're running on a secure PHP version, obviously.
Absolutely, yep.
Awesome. So this question is, what locations would you recommend for developers to improve on best practices for front-end and back-end Drupal development?
I think this question might be like, where can you learn, how can you deepen your skills in some of those areas specific to the Drupal world? So that is a great question. There's a lot of great community created content. So earlier I posted a link about Drupal Coder and PHP Code Sniffer that was written to a blog written by Jeff Geerling, who's a community member who's written tons of great content that can help you learn some foundational concepts or some more interesting concepts. Drupal.org has a variety of great documentation and tutorials about some best practices on both the front end and back end side. There's awesome recorded content from previous DrupalCons on the Drupal Association YouTube channel where you can learn some of these topics. And then finally, there's a variety of training companies out there that are doing right now distance virtual training or pre-recorded training content on any number of things in this area. So I think you can really get up to speed that way.
So 2 more tips about this. Out of this webinar, I would encourage you all to subscribe to the Drupal Planet RSS feed, because there's a lot of very valuable information that is being published by the Drupal community members, and to also subscribe to the Drupal Association YouTube channel to get the DrupalCon videos that Tim was talking about. And that really gets you a lot of very, very valuable material to learn Drupal.